When the longships beached on foreign shores, when the shields broke and the swords fell silent, the battle was not over. For the Vikings, victory was just the beginning. The men who died defending their lands were granted the mercy of a quick death. But their wives faced something far worse than the grave. If you enjoy these dark histories, leave a like and subscribe and comment below where you're listening from. I am genuinely curious to know where these stories are listened from around the world. What happened next was not random violence. It was systematic terror, refined over centuries into a machine of domination that stretched from the frozen fjords of Norway to the slave markets of Constantinople. The Vikings had turned human suffering into an industry, and women were their most valuable commodity. The aftermath of battle revealed the true horror. While warriors lay bleeding into the earth, Viking raiders moved through settlements with the efficiency of wolves. They separated people like livestock, men to the left, women to the right, children scattered like grain. The selection was methodical. Too old, dead. Too sick, dead. Too young to work or breed, dead. But the women of fighting age, the wives of the defeated, they were marked for something infinitely worse. They were about to become thralls, slaves in a system so brutal it would consume their identities, their bodies and their souls. The process began immediately. Viking officers, experienced in human trafficking, examined each woman like a piece of merchandise. They checked teeth for strength, limbs for labour capacity, faces for beauty that would command higher prices in distant markets. Young mothers were especially prized, their fertility proven, their desperation complete. These examinations were conducted in full view of surviving family members. Children watched their mothers prodded like cattle. Husbands who had survived the battle were forced to witness their wives being evaluated for sexual slavery. The psychological warfare was as deliberate as the physical violence. What made the Viking approach particularly cruel was its efficiency. This wasn't chaotic pillaging, it was organised commerce. Scribes recorded every detail: age, origin, skills, estimated value. These ledgers of human misery filled Longship holds alongside silver and furs. The documentation was obsessive. Each woman received a designation, a number that would follow her through the entire trafficking process. Her original name was immediately forgotten. She became merchandise with an inventory code tracked from capture to final sale like any other commodity. The journey to the slave markets was a nightmare that lasted weeks. Women were chained together in columns, forced to march across hostile terrain toward harbours where Viking ships waited. Those who collapsed were left to die. Those who resisted were beaten until submission became their only path to survival. The chains themselves were works of craftsmanship, designed specifically for human transport. Iron collars connected by lengths of rope or metal links, fitted to prevent escape while allowing just enough movement to keep the cargo alive. Archaeological evidence from sites like Birka and Hedeby reveals the industrial scale of these restraint systems. Viking guards specialised in managing these human caravans. They knew exactly how much food and water to provide. Enough to prevent death, never enough for strength. They understood the psychology of despair, using hope and desperation as tools of control. A woman who believed cooperation might lead to better treatment was easier to manage than one who had abandoned all hope. The routes were carefully planned. Viking slavers had mapped every path from battlefields to ports, identifying way stations where human cargo could be rested, fed, and secured. These stops weren't humanitarian. They were maintenance checkpoints designed to preserve the value of the merchandise. Women who tried to escape faced public punishment designed to terrorize the others. Some were burned with hot irons. Others were forced to watch as fellow escapees were tortured to death. The most defiant were sometimes crucified along the roadside, left as warnings to future captives. The psychological breakdown was systematic. Viking captors deliberately separated women who spoke the same language, preventing them from organizing or comforting each other. Sisters were split apart. Mothers were separated from daughters. Isolation became another tool of control. The ships themselves became floating prisons. Captive women were crammed into holds designed for cargo, not humans. Seasickness, disease, and despair claimed many before they ever reached their destination. The survivors learned quickly that compliance meant food, resistance meant starvation. Viking longships weren't designed for human transport, but slavers adapted them with brutal efficiency. Wooden partitions created holding areas where women were packed so tightly they couldn't lie down. Ventilation was minimal, privacy was non-existent. The stench of human waste, vomit, and fear permeated every plank. The ship crews were specially trained for this cargo. They knew how to prevent suicides, a constant risk when desperate women realized their fate. They understood the economics of loss prevention, calculating exactly how much suffering they could inflict without damaging the merchandise beyond repair. Food was distributed according to market value. Beautiful young women received better rations than older captives. Pregnant women were fed enough to preserve their unborn children, future slaves who represented long-term investment opportunities. The sick were often thrown overboard to prevent disease from spreading to more valuable cargo. The journey across the North Sea could take weeks. Women who had never been on ships before suffered from constant seasickness, made worse by the confined conditions and poor diet. Many prayed for death. Some achieved it. Their bodies were casually dumped overboard like spoiled goods. Weather added another layer of torment. Storm-tossed ships became torture chambers where terrified women were thrown against wooden walls and each other. Some suffered broken bones that never healed properly. Others sustained internal injuries that would plague them for life. The crews considered these damages acceptable losses in the cost of doing business. But the true horror revealed itself at journey's end. The slave markets of the Viking world were not hidden enterprises operating in shadows. They were legitimate businesses, regulated by law, taxed by authorities, blessed by the social order that sustained them. In Dublin, the largest slave market in the Western Viking world, women stood on wooden platforms while buyers examined them like horses at auction. Merchants tested their strength, evaluated their appearance, questioned their skills. Could she weave? Could she cook? Could she bear children? The answers determined her price and her fate. The Dublin slave market occupied prime real estate near the harbour, where ships could unload their human cargo directly onto the auction blocks. Permanent structures, holding pens, examination rooms, display platforms, demonstrated the institutional nature of this trade. The city's prosperity depended on human trafficking. Buyers came from across the known world, Irish nobles seeking household slaves, Norse merchants looking for breeding stock, Arab traders representing harems in distant Baghdad. Each market segment had specific preferences that Dublin slave dealers worked to satisfy. The auction process was theatrical. Women were cleaned, groomed, and dressed to maximize their appeal. Those with scars or injuries were positioned to hide their defects. Pregnant women were presented as two-for-one opportunities. The auctioneers were skilled salesmen who knew how to highlight each woman's commercial potential. Bidding wars could last hours. A particularly beautiful young woman might generate frenzied competition among wealthy buyers. The prices reached astronomical levels, sometimes equivalent to a small farm or several years' wages for a common labourer. These high-value sales subsidized the entire trafficking operation. But beauty was just one factor. Skills mattered enormously. A woman who could read and write commanded premium prices in markets where literacy was rare. Healers with knowledge of herbal medicine were especially valuable. Even cooking expertise could mean the difference between luxury slavery and brutal field labour. The most beautiful captives faced a destiny that seemed enviable, but was actually the cruelest of all: the halls of Viking lords. Forget the romanticized image of noble warriors treating captives with honor. The reality was a system designed to break women's spirits through psychological torment. A captured woman would be renamed, stripped of her Christian faith, forced to worship Norse gods under threat of violence. Her original identity was systematically erased. She became a tool for pleasure, a vessel for heirs, a symbol of her captor's power. Resistance brought beatings, starvation, or public humiliation that served as warnings to other captives. The great halls of Viking chieftains were designed to display wealth and power. Enslaved women were living ornaments, their beauty and exotic origins proof of their master's reach and influence. They were dressed in fine clothes and jewellery, not as gifts but as decorations that could be removed at will. These women lived in constant fear. A master's mood could determine whether they ate that day. A moment's hesitation in obeying commands could result in violent punishment. Their survival depended on reading subtle signals and anticipating their owner's desires before they were spoken. The psychological manipulation was sophisticated. Masters alternated between cruelty and kindness, keeping their slaves emotionally dependent. A woman who received unexpected gentleness became grateful, forgetting temporarily that her captor was also her tormentor. This emotional confusion made resistance harder and compliance more likely. Sexual slavery was systematic. Women were expected to be available whenever their masters desired them, regardless of their own physical or emotional state. Pregnancy offered no protection, it merely proved their usefulness as breeding stock. Childbirth in slavery meant watching their children become property of the same man who had destroyed their lives. The wives of important men, commanders, nobles, regional leaders, faced targeted degradation. Their humiliation was strategic, designed to break not just the individual, but the community watching. When a noble woman was paraded naked through Viking camps, forced to serve the men who had slaughtered her family, the message was clear. No status provides protection from our power. These high-profile captives underwent special processing. Their noble origins made them more valuable, but also more dangerous. Viking slavers developed specific techniques for breaking aristocratic women who were accustomed to command and respect. The degradation began immediately. Noble women were stripped of their fine clothes and jewellery, then dressed in rough slave garments. Their hair was cut in styles that marked them as property. They were forced to perform menial tasks, scrubbing floors, emptying waste buckets, serving food to common soldiers. But the psychological torment went deeper. These women were often educated, literate, and politically aware. They understood the broader implications of their captivity, how their suffering would affect their families, their communities, their entire social networks. This knowledge amplified their agony. Some were forced to write letters to their remaining family members, describing their new circumstances and urging surrender to prevent further bloodshed. These coerced communications became propaganda tools, spreading terror more effectively than any military threat. The most sadistic masters delighted in forcing noble women to participate in their own degradation. They were made to auction off their remaining possessions, to publicly renounce their titles and privileges, to declare their gratitude for their new status as slaves. These performances were recorded and shared as entertainment for other Viking lords. Viking law codified this brutality. The earliest Scandinavian legal texts treated enslaved women as property, no different from livestock or weapons. A master could beat, sell, or kill his thralls without legal consequence. The system wasn't an aberration. It was the foundation of Viking economy and social structure. The laws were detailed and specific. They outlined the rights of masters over their human property, established procedures for slave trading, and set standards for the treatment of different categories of bondage. These weren't primitive customs. They were sophisticated legal codes that governed a major industry. Property rights in human beings were absolute. A master could lend his slaves to others, use them as collateral for loans, or bequeath them to heirs in wills. Women could be traded like livestock, their children automatically belonging to whoever owned the mother. The legal system also established quality standards for slave trading. Merchants were required to disclose known defects in their human merchandise. Buyers had limited rights to return slaves who proved unsatisfactory. These commercial protections encouraged investment in the slave trade by reducing risk for purchasers. Courts regularly heard cases involving slave-related disputes. Property boundaries, ownership transfers, and damage claims filled legal records. The bureaucracy of human trafficking was as complex as any other major commercial enterprise. Penalties for helping slaves escape were severe. Anyone who aided runaways faced heavy fines, loss of property, or even enslavement themselves. These laws created a social environment where the entire population became complicit in maintaining the system of bondage. Archaeological evidence reveals the scope of this industry. Iron shackles found in Viking trading posts from Dublin to Hedeby tell the story of mass human trafficking. These weren't improvised restraints. They were manufactured goods, designed specifically for the slave trade that generated enormous wealth for Scandinavian merchants. The shackles themselves are masterworks of utilitarian design. Iron collars fitted with locks, connected to chains of precise lengths. Some include padding to prevent injury to valuable cargo. Others feature spikes or sharp edges designed to discourage escape attempts. The variety of design shows how the industry adapted to different transportation and control needs. Excavations at major Viking trading centres reveal the infrastructure of human commerce. Birka, Sweden's most important Viking Age city, has yielded not only shackles, but also specialised buildings that appear to have been designed for housing slaves. These structures feature reinforced doors, minimal windows, and secure courtyards. The harbour at Hedeby shows evidence of specialised loading areas where human cargo was transferred from ships to land transport. Wooden posts with iron rings provided attachment points for chains. Stone-lined channels directed waste away from valuable merchandise. The entire waterfront was designed to process human beings as efficiently as other trade goods. Bone analysis from Viking Age sites reveals the physical toll of slavery. Skeletons identified as likely thralls show evidence of malnutrition, repetitive stress injuries, and untreated trauma. The mortality rate among enslaved people was significantly higher than among free populations. Grave goods provide additional evidence. While free Vikings were buried with weapons, jewellery, and personal possessions, slaves were typically interred with only basic necessities, or nothing at all. Some burials show signs of sacrifice, slaves killed to accompany their masters into the afterlife. The scale was staggering. Historical sources suggest that up to 25% of Scandinavian populations during the Viking Age were enslaved people, mostly women captured during raids across Europe. These weren't small numbers. Entire demographic profiles of conquered regions were altered, as women disappeared into Scandinavian bondage. Contemporary chroniclers recorded massive slave-taking operations. The raid on Seville in 844 CE netted thousands of captives. The attack on Paris in 845 CE resulted in huge numbers of prisoners. These weren't isolated incidents. They were regular commercial expeditions designed to harvest human beings. The mathematics of slavery were brutal. A successful raid might capture hundreds of women and children. After accounting for deaths during transport and processing, perhaps half would reach the markets alive. Those survivors would sell for prices that made the entire expedition enormously profitable. Viking merchants developed sophisticated logistics for managing these numbers. They established way stations where large groups of captives could be held during processing. They created transportation schedules that moved human cargo as efficiently as any other bulk commodity. They maintained detailed inventories that tracked every aspect of their human merchandise. The economic impact was enormous. Slave trading generated wealth that funded further Viking expansion, built magnificent halls and ships, and established the social hierarchies that defined Scandinavian society. Entire kingdoms prospered through systematic human trafficking. Population studies reveal the demographic impact. Regions repeatedly targeted by Viking raids show significant gender imbalances in their archaeological records. Young women simply disappeared from the population, leaving behind communities struggling to maintain their social structures and reproductive capacity. The psychological warfare was deliberate. When Viking raiders struck a monastery or settlement, they didn't just take captives randomly. They specifically targeted the wives and daughters of local leaders, knowing that their fate would spread terror far beyond the immediate battlefield. A woman's screams carried further than any war horn. The selection process was designed to maximize psychological impact. Raiders would force husbands to choose which family members would be taken as slaves. Fathers were made to decide between daughters. Mothers were forced to select which children would accompany them into bondage. These impossible choices broke families even before the physical separation began. Community leaders were often forced to watch the processing of their female relatives. The message was clear: resistance brings consequences that extend far beyond the battlefield. Surrender might spare your women from the worst fates. This psychological pressure often proved more effective than military threats. The Vikings understood that terror was cumulative. Each successful raid created stories that travelled faster than longships. Communities across Europe learned to recognise the signs: unusual ship movements, the silence of coastal watchers, the distant sound of war horns. But knowing an attack was coming didn't make escape possible. The reputation for cruelty became a weapon itself. Many settlements surrendered without fighting when they saw Viking ships approaching, hoping that cooperation might result in better treatment for their women. Sometimes it did, often it didn't. The unpredictability was part of the strategy. Survivors who escaped or were eventually freed carried their trauma back to their communities. Their stories, filled with details of systematic abuse and degradation, spread terror throughout regions that had never directly experienced Viking raids. The psychological warfare continued long after the ships had sailed away. The forced conversions were particularly cruel. Christian women were dragged before Viking priests and forced to renounce their faith. Refusal meant torture that could last for days. Acceptance meant spiritual death, cutting them off from their God, their community, their very sense of self. They became religious orphans in a foreign land. The conversion ceremonies were theatrical performances designed to break spirits. Women were forced to publicly declare their abandonment of Christianity, to spit on crosses, to participate in pagan rituals that violated everything they had been taught to believe. The psychological violation was as traumatic as any physical abuse. Some women tried to maintain their faith in secret, but Viking masters had experience detecting religious resistance. Hidden prayers were punished severely. Secret, Christian symbols resulted in brutal beatings. Even the suspicion of continued Christian belief could lead to torture designed to extract confessions. The religious conversion served multiple purposes. It isolated women from potential rescue by Christian communities. It eliminated a source of psychological comfort and resistance. It demonstrated the complete power of Viking masters over every aspect of their slaves' existence. New religious obligations were imposed immediately. Women were required to participate in Norse rituals, to make offerings to pagan gods, to learn prayers in languages they didn't understand. Failure to demonstrate proper enthusiasm for their new faith brought swift punishment. The symbolism was carefully orchestrated. Christian women were forced to wear Thor's hammers instead of crosses. They had to eat foods forbidden by Christian dietary laws. They were made to participate in festivals that celebrated Viking victories over Christian lands. Every aspect of their daily lives reinforced their spiritual captivity. The breeding programs were systematic. Viking masters tracked the fertility cycles of their female slaves, treating them as livestock to be bred for future generations of bondage. Children born to enslaved mothers automatically became property of the master. Mothers were forced to raise children they could never truly protect or call their own. Pregnancy among slaves was managed like livestock breeding. Masters maintained detailed records of conception, gestation, and birth. They calculated the economic value of each pregnancy and made decisions about nutrition and care based on potential profitability rather than humanitarian concerns. Slave women who proved fertile were treated as valuable breeding stock. They received better food, adequate shelter, and medical care during pregnancy, not from compassion, but from economic calculation. A healthy mother was more likely to produce healthy slaves. The children of slaves faced automatic bondage from birth. They were raised in specialized facilities where they learned the skills that would make them valuable in the slave market. Boys might be trained as laborers or warriors. Girls were groomed for domestic service or sexual slavery. Family bonds among slaves were deliberately weakened. Children were separated from mothers at young ages to prevent the development of emotional attachments that might interfere with their utility as property. Brothers and sisters were scattered to different masters to eliminate potential sources of resistance. The economics were ruthless. A slave woman who could produce multiple healthy children during her fertile years represented a significant return on investment. Masters calculated the lifetime value of each female slave based on her reproductive potential as much as her labor capacity. The economic records are chilling. Arab merchants trading with Vikings documented prices for different categories of women. Young virgins commanded the highest prices, sometimes equivalent to several cows or a small farm. Experienced mothers cost less but were valued for their proven fertility. Older women were often worth no more than tools or weapons. The international dimensions of Viking slave trading were vast. Norse merchants operated in markets from Russia to North Africa, adapting their human merchandise to local preferences. Women captured in Christian lands were especially valuable in Islamic markets where their exotic appearance and foreign origins commanded premium prices. Different regions developed specializations based on their captive populations. Irish women were prized for their beauty and fair skin. Slavic captives were valued for their hardiness and agricultural skills. Anglo-Saxon women commanded high prices due to their reputation for domestic competence and literacy. The transportation networks were sophisticated commercial enterprises. Viking slave traders established regular routes connecting capture zones to major markets. They maintained way stations, developed shipping schedules, and created communication systems that coordinated supply with demand across vast distances. Quality control was rigorous throughout the international trade. Slave dealers developed standardized methods for evaluating and grading their human merchandise. Women were classified according to age, beauty, skills, and health status. These classifications determined not only prices but also treatment during transportation and sale. Market intelligence was crucial for profitability. Viking traders studied demand patterns in different regions, adjusting their raiding strategies to capture women with skills or appearances that would command the highest prices in specific markets. This intelligence gathering made slave trading more profitable than random pillaging. The restraint systems were sophisticated engineering projects. Iron shackles and chains were manufactured specifically for human transport, designed to prevent escape while preserving the value of the cargo. Different designs served different purposes: transport shackles, display chains, and permanent bondage systems. The manufacturing of restraints became a specialized industry. Smiths developed expertise in creating shackles that were secure but not damaging to valuable merchandise. They understood the engineering challenges of restraining humans without causing injuries that would reduce market value. Quality varied according to the intended use. High-value captives received well-made restraints with padding and careful fitting. Common slaves were secured with cheaper, cruder devices that prioritized security over comfort. The most rebellious captives faced special restraints designed to inflict continuous discomfort without permanent damage. Innovation was constant. Viking slavers continuously improved their methods for capturing, transporting, and controlling human beings. New types of restraints, better transportation techniques, and more effective control methods increased efficiency and reduced losses throughout the supply chain. The restraint systems were standardized across the Viking world. A woman shackled in Ireland could be transported to Constantinople without changing her bonds. This standardization reduced costs and improved efficiency in the international slave trade. Maintenance of restraint systems required specialized knowledge. Viking slavers employed experts who understood how to adjust shackles for different body types, repair damaged chains, and modify restraints for special circumstances. This technical expertise was passed down through generations of slavers. The training programs were methodical. Newly captured women were assigned to experienced slaves who taught them survival skills, which masters to avoid, how to minimize punishments, when silence was preferable to speech. These informal education systems helped some women survive, but they also institutionalized the acceptance of bondage. The indoctrination process began immediately after capture. Women were taught basic Norse phrases necessary for survival, but forbidden from speaking their native languages except in private. This linguistic isolation was another tool of control that gradually eroded their connection to their original identities. Veteran slaves became unwilling accomplices in the training system. They understood that helping new captives adapt to bondage was the only way to prevent unnecessary suffering. These mentorship relationships created complex emotional dynamics where victims became participants in their own oppression. The hierarchy among slaves was carefully maintained by their masters. Small privileges and better treatment were awarded to compliant slaves, creating competition and resentment that prevented unified resistance. Women fought for minor advantages while their captors maintained absolute control. Psychological conditioning was systematic. Masters used techniques that modern psychologists would recognize as brainwashing, isolation, dependency, intermittent reinforcement, and identity destruction combined to break down resistance and create compliant subjects. The most successful slaves learned to anticipate their master's needs and desires. This hypervigilance was a survival mechanism, but it also demonstrated the complete psychological domination that the system was designed to achieve. Women became extensions of their master's will, their own desires and preferences systematically eliminated. The religious justifications were carefully constructed. Viking poets and storytellers created narratives that portrayed slave-taking as divinely sanctioned. The gods rewarded brave warriors with human plunder. Captive women were gifts from Odin himself. These stories weren't entertainment. They were propaganda designed to legitimize systematic brutality. The cultural narratives surrounding slavery were deeply embedded in Viking society. Sagas celebrated heroes who captured beautiful women in foreign lands. Poems praised warriors who returned home with valuable human cargo. Children grew up hearing stories that normalized human trafficking as a legitimate activity. Religious ceremonies incorporated the display of captive women as symbols of divine favor. Women were forced to participate in rituals that celebrated their own enslavement. They became living proof of their captors' worthiness in the eyes of the gods. The documentation was meticulous. Viking merchants kept detailed records of their human cargo, tracking everything from prices paid to final destinations. These ledgers, discovered by archaeologists centuries later, reveal a bureaucracy of human trafficking that operated with the efficiency of modern corporations. Legal documents provide additional evidence of the systematic nature of Viking slavery. Contracts for slave purchases, wills bequeathing human property, and court records of disputes over ownership demonstrate that human trafficking was thoroughly integrated into Norse legal and economic systems. The written records show no evidence of moral qualms about slavery among Viking society. The brutality was not hidden or apologized for. It was openly celebrated as evidence of military prowess and divine blessing. The complete normalization of human trafficking was perhaps the most chilling aspect of the entire system. The impact on families was devastating and permanent. When Viking raiders struck, they deliberately separated mothers from children, wives from husbands, sisters from brothers. These separations were strategic. Isolated individuals were easier to control than family groups that might organize resistance or escape attempts. The demographic impact lasted for generations. Communities that lost large numbers of women struggled to maintain their population levels. Marriage patterns were disrupted. Birth rates declined. The social fabric of entire regions was permanently altered by the systematic removal of women through slave raids. The psychological trauma extended far beyond the immediate victims. Communities that witnessed the processing and removal of their women never forgot the experience. Stories of systematic abuse were passed down through generations, creating lasting terror that influenced behavior long after the Viking Age had ended. Economic disruption was severe and long-lasting. Communities that lost their women also lost their domestic production capacity. Textile work, food preparation, childcare, and other activities traditionally performed by women had to be reorganized or abandoned entirely. The cultural impact was profound. Languages lost speakers. Traditions were broken when the women who maintained them were carried away. Religious practices were disrupted when female practitioners were enslaved. Entire ways of a life disappeared when the people who sustained them were systematically removed. The genetic impact can still be detected today. Modern DNA analysis reveals the extent of Viking Age population mixing, much of it resulting from the forced movement of women through slave trading networks. The descendants of enslaved women carry genetic markers that tell the story of their ancestors' suffering. The transformation process was systematic and complete. Captured women underwent forced name changes, religious conversions, and cultural indoctrination designed to erase their previous identities. They were taught basic Norse phrases necessary for survival, but forbidden from speaking their native languages except in private. The market segregation was strategic and efficient. Different categories of enslaved women were sold in different venues for different purposes. The most beautiful were reserved for private auctions attended only by wealthy buyers. Common labourers were sold in public markets alongside other commodities. Damaged or difficult captives were sold cheaply to buyers who specialised in harsh agricultural work. The transportation security was sophisticated and effective. Viking slave traders employed guards specifically trained in managing human cargo. These specialists knew how to minimise escape attempts, prevent suicides, and maintain captives' basic health during long journeys. Their expertise was passed down through generations of slavers. The seasonal variations followed predictable and profitable patterns. Spring and summer raids captured the largest numbers of women, timed to coincide with agricultural cycles when communities were most vulnerable. Winter sales occurred in major trading centres where buyers gathered to purchase slaves for the coming year's work. The international dimensions were vast and interconnected. Viking slave traders operated in markets from Russia to North Africa, adapting their merchandise to local preferences. Women captured in Christian lands were especially valuable in Islamic markets, where their exotic appearance commanded premium prices. The legal frameworks were comprehensive and absolute. Different Viking territories developed specific laws governing slave ownership, trade, and treatment. These regulations weren't humanitarian. They were designed to protect property rights and ensure market stability. A master's rights over his slaves were nearly absolute. The cultural integration was forced and irreversible. Enslaved women who survived their initial captivity were gradually incorporated into Viking households, but always as subordinates. Some eventually gained limited freedoms or special positions, but these improvements came at the cost of abandoning all hope of returning to their original lives. The record-keeping was extensive and chilling. Viking trading posts maintained detailed inventories of slave populations, tracking ages, skills, health status, and market values. These records helped merchants make informed purchasing decisions and plan future raiding expeditions to capture specific types of captives. The punishment systems were elaborate and systematic. Viking masters developed sophisticated methods for controlling enslaved women that combined physical intimidation with psychological manipulation. Public beatings served as entertainment and education. Private torments broke individual spirits while maintaining the facade of civilized households. The breeding documentation was clinical and dehumanizing. Masters tracked the pregnancies, births, and child mortality rates of their female slaves with the same attention they devoted to livestock. Successful breeding females were valued and protected. Those who failed to produce children were often sold or relegated to heavy labor. The escape prevention was systematic and nearly foolproof. Viking settlements were designed to make flight nearly impossible. Slaves were housed in secure quarters, worked under constant supervision, and marked with distinctive clothing or brands that made them easily identifiable to bounty hunters who specialized in recapturing runaways. The historical records, preserved in monastery chronicles, Arabic travel accounts, and archaeological findings, provide undeniable evidence of a systematic industry built on human suffering. The Vikings transformed warfare from temporary violence into permanent exploitation, creating a machine that consumed the lives and identities of countless women across medieval Europe. The true horror was not in the violence of the initial capture, but in the systematic degradation that followed. The Vikings proved that civilization and brutality could coexist, that bureaucracy could organize horror, and that an entire society could prosper through the methodical destruction of human dignity. For the wives of defeated warriors, death in battle would have been mercy. Instead, they faced a fate designed to be worse than death. The complete erasure of their identities, the commodification of their bodies, and the transformation of their suffering into someone else's profit. The echo of their screams still resonates through history, a reminder of what happens when human beings are reduced to merchandise, when systematic cruelty is disguised as economic progress, and when an entire civilization builds its prosperity on the broken bodies of the defenseless. This was the true legacy of the Vikings, not just the conquest of lands, but the perfection of human misery as a commercial enterprise. They didn't just defeat their enemies, they transformed victory into an industry that turned human suffering into generational wealth. And perhaps most chilling of all, they documented everything. Every transaction, every price, every method of control was recorded, filed, and preserved. The Vikings weren't ashamed of their human trafficking. They were proud of their efficiency. The ledgers remain, filled with the names, ages, and prices of women whose identities were systematically destroyed. These records stand as monuments to an industry built on broken lives, a civilization that prospered through the methodical exploitation of human vulnerability. The wives of defeated warriors weren't just victims of war, they were raw materials in a machine designed to transform human dignity into Viking prosperity. Their suffering was not accidental, it was the point. The machinery ground on for centuries, consuming generations of women, transforming entire populations, reshaping the demographic and cultural landscape of medieval Europe. It ended not through moral awakening, but through economic and political changes that made other forms of exploitation more profitable. The women whose lives fed this machine remain largely nameless in history. Their individual stories were erased along with their identities, but their collective suffering carved deep scars across the landscape of human memory, scars that remain visible to those who know where to look. They were not statistics, they were not merchandise, they were human beings whose capacity for love, creativity, and joy was systematically destroyed to feed an empire built on organized cruelty. Their lives mattered. Their pain was real. Their voices, silenced by their captors, still cry out from the archaeological record and the fragments of testimony that survived the darkness. This is their story. This is their testimony. This is the truth that the Vikings' own records preserve for us. A civilization that achieved greatness through the systematic destruction of human dignity, prosperity through organized suffering, and immortality through the perfection of cruelty as an art form. The wives of defeated warriors deserved better. They deserved to live. They deserved to love. They deserved to die in their own beds, surrounded by children who shared their names and grandchildren who carried their stories forward. Instead, they were fed to a machine that consumed human souls and excreted silver coins. Their legacy is not in the sagas that celebrate their captors, but in the archaeological evidence of their suffering and the genetic markers they passed to descendants who never knew their names. They were human beings. They mattered. And their stories, even told through the records of their oppressors, demand that we remember not just the glory of Viking expansion, but the price paid by those who were crushed beneath it. This was what Vikings did to the wives of defeated warriors. This was why it was worse than death. This was the systematic transformation of human beings into commodities, souls into silver, dignity into profit. The machine has stopped running. The longships no longer sail. The slave markets have crumbled to dust. But the echoes remain. The testimony endures, the truth survives, and in remembering their suffering we honour the humanity that their captors tried so desperately to destroy.